In 1964, Phil Spector, the most powerful producer in America, listened to an Otis Redding demo and passed. His verdict was brutal. The voice is too rough, too raw, too black for mainstream radio. He will never cross over. 3 years later, Otis stood on the Monterey Pop stage in front of the whitest audience in America and made every single one of them scream his name. Phil Spector was watching from the VIP section. He never said another word about Otis Redding. But here is what nobody tells you about that night. What nobody tells you about the journey that led to that stage, to that moment, to that thunderclap of sound that split the air above Monterey and changed American music forever. Because before Otis Redding was a legend, he was just a skinny kid from Dawson, Georgia, standing in a church doorway, listening to a choir sing, and feeling something move inside his chest that he had no words for yet. Georgia summer, 1956. Dawson was the kind of town where the heat pressed down on you like a hand, where the red clay roads baked hard in August, and the pecan trees drooped in the afternoons. Otis Redding was 14 years old, and he was already carrying something heavy. Not poverty, though there was plenty of that. Not the particular cruelty of the American South, though that was everywhere too. What Otis carried was a sound that lived inside his ribcage and had no exit yet. His father, Otis Redding Sr., was a sharecropper who had moved the family to Macon when Otis was a child, chasing the dream of something better. The family settled in the Tyndall Heights housing project. His father eventually became a deacon at Veneville Baptist Church. And it was there, inside that small, hot church, with the wood pews and the cardboard fans and the voices rising toward a ceiling that seemed too low to contain them. It was there that Otis Jr. first understood what a human voice could do. Have you ever heard something that made you feel less alone? Not just entertained, not just moved, but fundamentally, physically less alone in the world, as if the sound itself was proof that someone else had felt what you were feeling. That is what the church choir did to Otis Redding at 14. And from that moment, he understood his purpose with a clarity that most people spend their entire lives searching for. He started singing in that church. Then he started entering talent contests at the Douglas Theater on Broadway in Macon. He won. Then he won again. Then he won again. 15 times in a row, the same contest, until they quietly stopped inviting him back because it was no longer a contest when Otis entered the room. He was 16 years old. His father wanted him to get a real job. His mother worried about him. Macon, Georgia in the late 1950s was not a place where a young black man with a dream could afford too many mistakes. The walls were everywhere. Visible and invisible, legal and social, the kind that could end a life or a dream with equal efficiency. Otis Redding saw all of them. He walked toward them anyway. He dropped out of school at the age of 15 to help support his family. He drove a water truck. He dug wells. He did whatever work he could find. But every free moment, every Saturday night, every church Sunday, every talent show within driving distance, Otis was singing. Little Richard was his god. He would perform Little Richard songs with everything he had, every muscle, every molecule of air in his lungs, and the crowds would lose their minds. But there was something else underneath the Little Richard imitation. Something that was purely Otis. A rawness. A pleading quality. A sound like a man who needed you to understand something that could not be said any other way. You could hear it even then, beneath the showmanship, beneath the borrowed moves and the borrowed gospel fury. You could hear the real Otis Redding trying to get out. He met Phil Walden, a young white music promoter from Macon who would become his manager when they were both teenagers. Walden had heard Otis perform and immediately understood that he was looking at something extraordinary. The two of them. a young black singer from the housing projects and a young white promoter from a middle-class family, formed a partnership that was unusual for the American South in 1960 and would have been impossible in many parts of it. Walden started booking Otis wherever he could. Small clubs, college dances, any stage that would have him. And then came the moment that should have changed everything, and almost did not. In 1962, Otis drove to Memphis with Johnny Jenkins and the Pinatoppers, for whom he had been working as a driver and occasional singer. Johnny Jenkins had a recording session booked at Stax Records on McLemore Avenue, a former movie theater that had been converted into one of the most important recording studios in the history of American music. Otis was there to drive the car and maybe, get a few minutes at the end of the session if there was time left over. There was time left over. 45 minutes. Otis Redding walked into Stax Records with 45 minutes and walked out with a record deal. He sang a ballad called These Arms of Mine. He had written it himself. Slow Hing, the kind of song that felt like it had always existed, like it had simply been waiting for someone with the right voice to find it. The Stax House Band, which would become known as Booker T, and the MGs, played behind him, and Jim Stewart, who ran Stax with his sister Estelle Axton, sat in the control room and listened. Stewart was not an easy man to impress. He had heard 1,000 singers. But something happened when Otis sang. The room changed temperature. Something shifted in the air. "We recorded it right then," Stewart later said. "There was nothing to discuss. You either hear it or you do not, and everybody in that room heard it." These Arms of Mine was released in late 1962. It climbed the rhythm and blues charts slowly at first, then built and built until it reached the top 20. For a ballad from an unknown 21-year-old from Macon, Georgia, it was astonishing. And it was only the beginning. But here is where the story gets complicated, because Otis Redding was succeeding, genuinely, measurably succeeding, in a world that was not built for him to succeed in. The rhythm and blues market was largely segregated. Black artists made records that were played on black radio stations, sold in black neighborhoods, and largely ignored by the mainstream music industry that controlled the money and the visibility. The wall between rhythm and blues and what the industry called pop, meaning what white audiences would buy, was not just a wall, it was a fortress. And then Phil Spector looked at Otis Redding and told him, with the casual certainty of someone who controls the gates, that his voice was too rough, too raw, too black for mainstream radio. Let that land for a moment. The man who would go on to create the most emotionally devastating music of the 20th century was told that his voice was a liability. Otis Redding heard that verdict. He understood what it meant, not just about Phil Spector's taste, but about the entire architecture of the music business and what it was built to protect. He went back to Macon. He went back to Stax. He kept working. Between 1962 and 1967, Otis Redding recorded a catalog of music that is almost incomprehensible in its quality and consistency. Pain in My Heart, Pitiful, I Have Been Loving You Too Long, Respect, yes, that Respect, the song that Aretha Franklin would later transform into an anthem, but which began as Otis Redding's own urgent, almost desperate plea. Try a Little Tenderness, Shake, Old Man Troubled, each one a complete world, each one a masterclass in how to make a human being feel something. He toured constantly. He played the Chitlin Circuit, the network of venues across the American South and beyond where black artists performed for black audiences, often under conditions that were exploitative and sometimes dangerous. He played hundreds of dates a year. He slept on buses and in cheap hotels and in the back seats of cars. He played through exhaustion and illness and the particular grinding fatigue of a man who is working 3 times as hard as his white counterparts for a fraction of the recognition. But something else was happening too. Word was spreading. Musicians knew. Within the industry, within the world of people who actually understood what great music was, Otis Redding's name was spoken with a kind of reverence. The Rolling Stones talked about him. Jimi Hendrix talked about him. Keith Richards said that Otis Redding was one of the reasons he wanted to play music. These were not small voices. And yet, the mainstream, the charts, the radio stations that reached the suburbs and the shopping malls and the college campuses full of white kids who were busy discovering the British invasion and thinking that was where the revolution was. That world still did not know Otis Redding's name until June 1967. The Monterey International Pop Festival was conceived as something that had never existed before, a massive outdoor music festival that would bring together the most important artists in the world and demonstrate that popular music had grown into something that deserved to be taken seriously. The lineup was extraordinary: Janis Joplin, Simon and Garfunkel, The Who, Jefferson Airplane, Jimi Hendrix, the Mamas and the Papas, and dozens more. It was organized by Lou Adler and John Phillips, and it drew nearly 200,000 people over 3 days to the Monterey County Fairgrounds in California. And specifically, someone with the sense to listen to people who actually knew music, had the wisdom to book Otis Redding. Saturday night, June 17, 1967. The crowd at Monterey was, as Otis himself later described it, the first white audience I've ever had. He was not being entirely literal. He had played to mixed audiences before, but he was describing something real. This was a different world than the Chitlin circuit, different world than the rhythm and blues clubs. This was 50,000 people who had grown up on folk music and British rock and Bob Dylan, who maybe had heard of Otis Redding in the abstract, who maybe owned one of his records, but who had no real idea, of what was about to happen to them. Otis walked out onto that stage in a green suit. He was 25 years old. He picked up the microphone. He looked out at 50,000 people he had never played for before, a sea of faces that stretched back into the California evening, and something moved across his expression, not nerves, not exactly, but something like the awareness of a man who understands that this moment matters. And then he opened his mouth. The band hit the groove and Otis Redding began to perform, and something happened that people who were there have spent the last several decades trying to describe. He moved. He sweated. He screamed. He whispered. He bent his knees and threw back his head and let the sound come out of him like it had been stored under pressure for years. He sang "I Can't Turn You Loose," and the crowd started moving before they fully realized they were moving. He sang "Respect," and the crowd began to understand. He sang "I've Been Loving You Too Long," and the sound he made, that pleading, anguished, beautiful sound, reached the back rows, and the people in the back rows felt it in their sternum. There is concert footage from that night. Not a lot, but some. And, if you watch the crowd, specifically, you can see the moment it happens. The moment when 50,000 people who came to see a show stopped being an audience and became something else. Became people who were being spoken to directly, personally, in a language they did not know they understood. Otis stopped the band at one point. Just stopped them, in the middle of the noise and the energy and the building momentum. A beat of silence, and then he leaned into the microphone and said, quietly, with complete confidence, "This is the love crowd, right? We all love each other, don't we?" And 50,000 people answered him back. He ended with "Try a little tenderness. If you know the song, you know what happens in the last 2 minutes, how it builds, how it accelerates, how Otis Redding transforms from a singer into something that has no good English word. How the music becomes, for those 2 minutes, something close to ecstatic. The crowd at Monterey came undone. Not politely, not in the restrained way of people who are seeing something they admire. They came undone the way people come undone when something breaks through every wall they have built and reaches the part of them that does not have a wall. Backstage afterward, musicians who had been watching from the wings were standing very still. Jimi Hendrix, who was scheduled to perform later, and who was already one of the most extraordinary performers alive, was quiet. The words people used later were not the words of music criticism. They were the words of people who had witnessed something they did not entirely have a category for. Phil Spector, who was in the VIP section, was seen leaving early. He did not comment on the performance. He did not need to. The reviews were immediate and total. The next morning, every major music publication in America was trying to find words for what Otis Redding had done. Words like explosive and transcendent appeared, but they were insufficient. Rolling Stone, which had only recently launched, wrote about the performance in terms that had previously been reserved for Miles Davis and Ray Charles. Something had shifted, something that could not be unshifted. Otis Redding flew back to Macon. He went home to his wife Zelma and his children on the Big O Ranch. He had work to do. The months after Monterey were the most productive of his career. He was writing constantly. There was an urgency to his work that his bandmates noticed, a focus that felt different from the relentless touring energy that had characterized the first years of his career. He was trying to get to something, reaching for something that was just beyond the edge of what he had already done. In November 1967, Otis Redding went to Stax Records in Memphis and spent 3 days working on a new song. He sat on a houseboat in Sausalito, California, and he wrote the first lines on a yellow legal pad. He had been thinking about stillness, about what it meant to rest, about the view of the bay and the water and the feeling of watching the world move while you sat absolutely still. He took the idea back to Memphis. He recorded a skeletal version with the guitar part. That descending figure, those notes like drops of water falling. And he sang a rough vocal. The song had a whistle in it at the end, because he had not yet written all the lyrics, and he needed something to fill the space. He planned to go back and finish it. He went home to Macon. On December 10, 1967, Otis Redding boarded his twin-engine Beechcraft airplane at the Cleveland Hopkins International Airport. He was flying to Madison, Wisconsin for a concert. The plane went down into Lake Monona, 3 miles from the Madison airport. Otis Redding was 26 years old. The whistled ending stayed in the final recording. Because the recording that existed, the rough vocal, the unfinished lyric, the improvised whistle, was the only recording there was. Jim Stewart listened to it and understood, as everyone who heard it understood, that it needed nothing more, that it was, in the form it existed in, already complete, already impossibly, more than anyone could have asked for. Sitting on the dock of the bay, watching the tide roll away, sitting on the dock of the bay, wasting time. The song was released on January 8, 1968, less than a month after Otis Redding died. It went to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, the first posthumous #1 single in the history of American popular music. It crossed over. It reached mainstream radio. It reached the suburbs and the shopping malls and the college campuses and the white kids who had been too busy with the British invasion to notice what was happening on Lemoore Avenue in Memphis. Phil Spector's assessment proved to be precisely wrong about the music, and precisely right about what the industry had been willing to do with it. The voice was rough. The voice was raw. And it turned out that was exactly what the world needed. There is a question that sits at the center of Otis Redding's story, and it is not a comfortable one. The question is this: what would have happened if the walls had been lower? If the industry had not been built the way it was built? If the radio stations had been willing to play his records 5 years earlier? If the Monterey moment had come when Otis was 21, not 25? We will never know the answer to that question. What we know is the music that existed. What we know is that in the time he had, which was not enough time, which was never going to be enough time, Otis Redding created a catalog that has outlasted every single person who told him what he could not do. Songs that have been covered hundreds of times and never equaled. Performances that live on film and in memory, and in the testimony of everyone who was there, who will always say, that they never saw anything like it before and never saw anything like it again. He did not get to hear Aretha Franklin's version of Respect, which came out in April 1967 and became one of the defining songs of the civil rights movement. He was alive when it was released. He heard it, reportedly expressed admiration and some surprise at what she had done with it, and said simply that she had taken his song to somewhere he had not known it could go. That is the kind of man Otis Redding was. Not a man who needed to be the only one in the room. Not a man who measured his success by whether he had diminished someone else. A man who wrote songs about tenderness and love and the desperate human need to be understood, and who meant every word. The Big O Ranch in Macon is still there. The Stax Museum of American Soul Music stands on the site of the original studio in Memphis. The footage from Monterey exists, digitized and preserved. And if you watch it on a screen today, decades removed from that June night in California, you can still feel it. The thing that made 50,000 strangers become something larger than themselves. The thing that Phil Spector said was too rough, too raw, too much. There is a lesson in this story, but it is not the simple kind. It is not just about perseverance. Though Otis Redding had more of it than almost anyone. It is not just about talent, though the talent was extraordinary and undeniable. It is about the particular cruelty of a world that builds walls around certain voices and calls it taste. That measures certain kinds of music against a standard that was never designed to see them clearly. That tells a 20-year-old kid from Macon, Georgia, that his voice is a problem to be solved rather than a gift to be received. Otis Redding did not solve his voice. He did not sand down its edges or smooth out its roughness, or make it more palatable to the people who controlled the gates. He sang louder. He sang rawer. He sang from a place so deep and so real that eventually even the walls could not hold it back. The dock of the bay is still there. The tide still rolls. And somewhere in the space between those notes, in that descending guitar figure, in that whistled ending, in the voice of a 26-year-old man who ran out of time before the world ran out of need for him, Otis Redding is still sitting, still watching, still waiting. Some lights are too bright to stay hidden. Some voices are too necessary to stay quiet. And some souls, the ones that burn at the right temperature, the ones that carry inside them something the rest of us can barely name. Some souls leave a warmth behind them that no amount of time can fully cool. If this story moved you, if the voice of Otis Redding has ever found you at exactly the right moment and said exactly the right thing, share it. Tell someone who has never heard it. Turn it up, because that is what he would have wanted. Not monuments, not museums, not documentaries. Just the music, moving through the air, finding the people who needed it. That was always the whole point.